The summer of 1940 hung heavy over the scrapyard in Cleveland, Ohio, where dust devils danced between towers of twisted metal and rusted chassis. Jake Morrison wiped the grease from his hands onto already stained coveralls, surveying his kingdom of forgotten machines with the kind of pride that made other men laugh. At 42, with silver threading through his dark hair and permanent oil stains under his fingernails, he cut an unimpressive figure to those who didn't know better. The Morrison salvage yard had been in his family for 3 generations, sitting on 5 acres of prime real estate that developers eyed hungrily. But Jake refused every offer, clinging to the belief that one man's trash was another man's treasure. His neighbors called him stubborn. His ex-wife called him a dreamer. The local mechanics called him when they needed parts they couldn't find anywhere else. Jake lived in a small apartment above the office, a cramped space filled with aviation magazines, technical manuals, and blueprints he'd been collecting since he was a boy. His father had been a mechanic for the Army Air Corps during the Great War, and those stories of roaring engines and daring pilots had planted something deep in Jake's soul. He'd never had the money for flight school, never had the education for engineering school, but he had something else. An intuitive understanding of how things worked, how metal could be shaped and bent and convinced to fly. The radio in his office crackled with news from across the Atlantic. London was burning. Nazi bombers filled British skies night after night, and the Royal Air Force was bleeding pilots and planes faster than they could replace them. America wasn't in the war yet, but Jake could feel it coming like a storm on the horizon. He'd been working on something in secret, something that kept him up until 3 in the morning most nights, something that consumed every spare dollar he had. In the back corner of the yard, hidden under a massive tarp and surrounded by strategically placed junk, sat Jake's obsession. He called it the Scrapyard Hurricane, a shameless tribute to the British fighter that was holding the line over England. But his version was built entirely from salvaged parts. The engine from a crashed crop duster, wings from a defunct mail plane, a propeller he'd painstakingly repaired and balanced, landing gear from 3 different sources, the fuselage he'd welded himself, working from photographs and whatever technical specifications he could get his hands on. Marcus Webb showed up on a Tuesday afternoon, stepping carefully through the yard in shoes too expensive for the terrain. He was from the War Department, he said, part of a team evaluating civilian contributions to the war effort. Jake's neighbors had mentioned his project, mostly as a joke, and Webb had come to see what the fuss was about. Jake led him to the back corner, his heart hammering. This was his moment, his chance to prove that the countless hours and sleepless nights meant something. He pulled back the tarp with a flourish, revealing the aircraft beneath. Webb stared for a long moment, then began to laugh. It started as a chuckle, then built into a full belly laugh that echoed across the scrapyard. Jake felt his face burning, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "This isn't a fighter plane," Webb said when he could breathe again. "This is a death trap. You've welded together a flying coffin from garbage. Do you have any idea what tolerances real aircraft require? What materials testing involves? This thing would tear itself apart the moment you tried to take off, assuming the engine didn't explode first." Other men from the War Department arrived, drawn by Webb's laughter. They circled the scrapyard hurricane like vultures, pointing out every flaw, every mismatched part, every weld that wasn't military standard. One of them actually kicked the landing gear, as if testing its structural integrity with his foot would prove anything. Jake tried to explain his modifications, the careful calculations he'd made, the testing he'd done on individual components. But his voice was drowned out by their derision. "You're a junkyard mechanic playing at being an engineer," Webb said dismissively. "Leave the real work to people who know what they're doing. America needs factories and steel, not fantasy projects from amateur pilots who never even got their license." They left him standing there, their laughter fading as they walked back to their government cars. Jake stood alone beside his creation, feeling the weight of their mockery settling into his bones. Around the scrapyard, he could hear his neighbors talking, spreading the story. By morning, everyone in Cleveland would know that Jake Morrison's crazy airplane had been officially declared worthless by the War Department itself. He ran his hand along the fuselage, feeling the seams where he joined different pieces of metal into something new. Maybe they were right, he thought. Maybe he was just a dreamer who'd wasted years on an impossible project. The mockery spread like wildfire through Cleveland's industrial district. By Wednesday morning, Jake couldn't walk into Bernie's diner without the conversation stopping, replaced by barely suppressed snickers. The mechanics who used to respect his talent for finding impossible parts now avoided eye contact. Even old Tom, who'd worked alongside Jake's father, shook his head sadly when he saw him pumping gas at the corner station. The Cleveland Plain Dealer ran a small piece on page 7. Local scrap dealers' war machine dream deemed unsafe by federal officials. They'd included a photograph someone had taken of the Scrapyard Hurricane, making it look even more ramshackle than it was, all mismatched panels and visible welds. The caption read, "Enthusiasm isn't enough when lives are at stake." Jake's landlord, Mrs. Chun, slipped an eviction notice under his apartment door Thursday evening. The scrapyard rent was 2 months overdue. Money he'd poured into materials and parts instead. She was kind about it, apologetic even, but business was business. He had 30 days to come up with the back rent plus next month, or both he and his scrapyard would be gone. Friday afternoon brought Tommy Patterson, a young man of 19 with sandy hair and his father's eyes. Jake had known the Patterson family for years, had watched Tommy grow up running through the scrapyard, fascinated by anything with wings. 6 months ago, Tommy had enlisted in the Army Air Corps, desperate to fly, to fight, to matter. He'd washed out of pilot training last week, the instructor saying he didn't have the reflexes, didn't have what it took. Tommy found Jake working alone in the yard, mechanically sorting scrap metal into piles, his movements automatic and joyless. "Mr. Morrison," Tommy said quietly, "I heard what happened. I'm sorry. I know what it feels like when people say you're not good enough." Jake looked at the kid, saw the defeat in his shoulders, the dream dying in his eyes. "That's different," he said roughly. "You're young, you've got time to find something else. Me, I'm just the punchline now. The idiot who thought he could build a fighter plane out of garbage." Tommy picked up a piece of aluminum, turning it over in his hands. "My dad always said you could fix anything, make anything work. He said you had magic in your hands, that you understood machines better than anyone he'd ever met. Was he wrong?" The question hit Jake harder than all the mockery combined. He thought about his father, about the stories of improvised repairs in muddy French airfields, about making do with what you had because lives depended on it. He thought about giving up, about letting the developers tear down everything his family had built, about becoming just another forgotten man in a city full of them. That night, Jake climbed into the cockpit of the Scrapyard Hurricane for the first time in weeks. He sat there in the darkness, hands on the controls he'd fashioned from salvaged parts, and made a decision that terrified him. He was going to prove them all wrong, even if it killed him. Jake spent the entire weekend running final checks, testing every system he could without actually starting the engine. He reinforced the weaker welds, double-checked fuel lines, and went over every inch of the airframe with the obsessive attention of a man betting his life on his own work. Monday morning arrived cold and clear, perfect flying weather, and Jake knew he couldn't wait any longer. He rolled the Scrapyard Hurricane out of its hiding spot at dawn, before the neighbors were awake, before anyone could stop him or call the authorities about the madman about to kill himself. The plane looked almost proud in the early light, its mismatched panels telling the story of its creation. Tommy Patterson appeared at the gate just as Jake was finishing his pre-flight check. "You're really doing this," Tommy said. It wasn't a question. "Got nothing left to lose," Jake replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "Either this works and I prove them wrong, or it doesn't and at least I went down trying." Tommy helped him clear the makeshift runway Jake had created by moving junk to the edges of his largest open area. It wasn't much, maybe 800 feet of relatively flat ground, but it would have to be enough. As Jake climbed into the cockpit, Tommy grabbed his arm. "Mr. Morrison, whatever happens, you built something. You didn't just talk about it or dream about it. You built it. That matters." Jake nodded, not trusting his voice, and strapped himself in. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life with a sound that was music to his ears. The propeller spun, balanced and true, and he could feel the aircraft trembling with contained energy beneath him. He advanced the throttle slowly, feeling the scrapyard hurricane begin to roll forward, picking up speed. The fence at the end of his property rushed toward him. Jake pulled back on the stick, felt the resistance, felt the moment of truth where physics would either embrace or reject everything he'd built. The wheels left the ground. The scrapyard hurricane climbed, shaking but flying, actually flying, and Jake let out a whoop of pure joy that nobody could hear over the engine's roar. He circled Cleveland at 2,000 feet, his heart soaring higher than his aircraft. Every rivet held, every weld stayed true, every salvaged part worked exactly as he'd intended. Below him, people were stopping in the streets, pointing up at the strange plane with its patchwork skin catching the morning sun. If you're watching this story and believing in second chances, in people who refuse to give up, take a moment and subscribe to this channel. Because what happens next, nobody could have predicted, and Jake Morrison's real test was just beginning. He landed smoothly, the touchdown so gentle it barely registered, and taxied back to his spot. Tommy was jumping up and down, shouting congratulations, but Jake barely heard him. His mind was already racing ahead, already planning. Word of the successful flight spread faster than the mockery had. By Tuesday afternoon, a small crowd gathered outside Morrison's salvage yard. Some curious, some skeptical, all wanting to see the scrapyard plane that actually flew. Jake took the scrapyard hurricane up 3 more times that week, each flight longer and more ambitious than the last, pushing the aircraft through basic maneuvers, testing its limits, proving it wasn't just a fluke. On Friday, a telegram arrived from Washington. Captain Robert Chun, Army Air Corps, would be arriving Monday to personally evaluate the aircraft. This time, there would be no mockery, no dismissal without inspection. Jake spent the weekend polishing every surface, organizing his documentation, preparing to defend every choice he'd made. Captain Chun arrived alone, a slim man of 35 with pilot's eyes that missed nothing. He spent 4 hours going over the scrapyard hurricane, asking technical questions that revealed a deep understanding of aircraft design. Unlike Webb, Chun examined the modifications with genuine interest, noting the clever solutions Jake had improvised for problems that would have stopped most builders. "Take me up," Chun said finally. "If you're willing to risk your life in this thing, I should be willing to risk mine." They flew for 40 minutes, Chun taking the controls for part of the flight, testing responsiveness, checking stability, pushing the aircraft through maneuvers that made Jake's heart race. When they landed, Chun was quiet for a long moment, staring at the plane with an expression Jake couldn't read. "This shouldn't work," Chun said slowly. "By every conventional standard, this aircraft should have torn itself apart. But you've done something remarkable here, Morrison. You've proven that ingenuity and determination can overcome limited resources. The question is, can you do it again?" The proposal was audacious. Britain desperately needed fighters, but factory production couldn't keep pace with losses. What if Jake could train other mechanics, other builders, to create serviceable aircraft from salvaged parts? Not for frontline combat, but for training, for coastal patrol, for freeing up factory-fresh planes for the real fighting. It wouldn't be pretty, it wouldn't be by the book, but wars weren't won by books alone. Within 2 weeks, Jake had a contract, a team of 12 hand-picked mechanics, and a warehouse twice the size of his scrapyard. They called themselves the Scrapyard Squadron, and their mission was to build the impossible. Jake's first hurricane was their template, their proof of concept, their reminder that American ingenuity could triumph over any shortage. By December, they had completed 7 aircraft, each one unique, each one airworthy, each one built from parts that other people had thrown away. When Pearl Harbor brought America fully into the war, those 7 planes were assigned to coastal defense in California, watching for Japanese submarines and raiders. And that's when Jake Morrison's greatest moment arrived, the vindication he'd never dared imagine. March 1942 brought fog to the California coast, the kind of thick blanket that reduced visibility to mere yards and turned the ocean into an invisible threat. Jake had relocated to San Diego to oversee his squadron's operations, living in a sparse barracks room but feeling more purpose than he'd known in years. His 7 scrapyard hurricanes, as they become officially known, were spread along the coastline, flown by pilots who'd washed out of frontline training but found redemption in second chances. Tommy Patterson flew Scrapyard 3, his reflexes perfect for the patient work of patrol flying. The morning of March 15th started like any other, with pre-dawn briefings and thermos coffee that tasted like motor oil. Then the radar station picked up something unusual, multiple contacts approaching from the west, flying low to avoid detection. Japanese bombers, 7 of them, heading straight for the naval shipyard at San Pedro. The frontline squadrons were 200 miles north on exercises, leaving only Jake's ragtag patrol planes between the enemy and their target. The order came through crackling radio static. Intercept and engage. Jake's heart nearly stopped. His planes weren't built for combat, weren't armed for dogfighting, weren't supposed to face enemy fire. But there was no choice, no time, no one else. He watched his 7 Scrapyard Hurricanes scramble into that gray morning, their mismatched panels and salvaged parts carrying pilots who believed in them because Jake had believed first. The engagement lasted 18 minutes, but Jake lived each second in agonizing slow motion from the radio room. Tommy's voice came through first, calm and steady, calling out positions. Then chaos erupted as his pilots, flying planes held together by skill and determination, threw themselves at bombers that outgunned them completely. One by one, the reports came in. Scrapyard 5 had forced a bomber to turn back, its formation broken. Scrapyard 2 and 7 worked in tandem, harrying another until it jettisoned its bombs harmlessly into the ocean. Tommy's voice rose in excitement as he lined up a deflection shot that sent a third bomber spiraling down, trailing smoke. When the fog finally lifted and the 7 Scrapyard Hurricanes limped home, every single one damaged but still flying, the impossible had happened. 7 enemy bombers either destroyed or driven off, the shipyard untouched, 0 American casualties. Jake stood on the tarmac as his pilots landed, watching Tommy climb out of his cockpit with a grin that could have lit the whole base. Marcus Webb arrived 3 days later, no longer laughing, his government credentials in hand and an official apology prepared. The story had reached Washington, reached the newspapers, reached a nation hungry for heroes. But Jake barely heard the apology, barely registered Webb's praise for the Scrapyard Squadron's expansion to 50 aircraft. He was watching his planes being repaired, watching mechanics who'd learned from him patch bullet holes with the same improvised genius he'd taught them. His father would have been proud. September 1945. The war was over, the ticker tape parades had ended, and America was learning to be peaceful again. Jake Morrison stood in front of a brand new facility in Burbank, California, watching workers install a sign that read Morrison Aeronautical Innovations. The scrapyard in Cleveland was gone, sold to developers who'd finally gotten their wish, but Jake no longer needed it. The Scrapyard Squadron had grown to over 200 aircraft during the war, serving in training roles, coastal defense, and reconnaissance missions. 18 of Jake's original mechanics had gone on to work for major aircraft manufacturers, carrying with them the lessons learned from making miracles out of scrap metal. Tommy Patterson had survived the war with a Distinguished Flying Cross and was now Jake's chief test pilot, putting experimental designs through their paces with the same enthusiasm he'd shown as a kid running through the salvage yard. Captain Robert Chun, now a colonel, arrived for the facility's dedication ceremony in full dress uniform. He'd been the one to recognize what Jake's work really meant, that innovation didn't always come from universities and laboratories, that sometimes the greatest breakthroughs came from necessity and stubborn determination. Chun had fought to preserve records of the Scrapyard Squadron's techniques, ensuring that future engineers would study what Jake had accomplished. Mrs. Chun from Cleveland was there too, flown out at Jake's expense, seated in the front row with a plaque thanking her for her patience during the lean years. She'd never cashed that eviction notice, had held onto it as a reminder that sometimes people deserved one more chance to prove themselves. Marcus Webb sent a telegram of congratulations but didn't attend. Jake didn't mind. The man's laughter had been the catalyst that transformed desperation into determination, mockery into motivation. In a strange way, Webb had given Jake the greatest gift possible, the fire that forged something unbreakable. The ceremony concluded with a flyover, 7 vintage Scrapyard Hurricanes that Jake had preserved, restored, and maintained as a reminder of where he'd come from. They roared overhead in perfect formation, their mismatched panels gleaming in the California sun, piloted by some of the original squadron members who'd volunteered for one more flight. Jake gave a short speech, his voice rougher than he'd intended, thanking everyone who'd believed when belief seemed foolish, who'd trusted salvage dreams and improvised solutions. But the words that mattered most came at the end, when he looked directly at the young people in the audience, the next generation of dreamers and builders. "Never let anyone tell you that your ideas are worthless," he said. "Never let mockery stop you from building something you believe in. The greatest innovations in history came from people who refused to accept that something couldn't be done. Start where you are, use what you have, and never stop believing in the impossible." Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If it inspired you, hit that like button, drop a comment about which historical figure or unsung hero you'd like to hear about next, and subscribe so you never miss these incredible true stories of determination and triumph. Because history is full of people like Jake Morrison, people who changed the world one salvage dream at a time. The scrapyard mechanic had become a legend, and 7 bombers over London would never know how close they'd come to succeeding. Stopped by a man they'd laughed at and a plane built from garbage that refused to quit.